I sat in the corner booth of a small cafe on West 72nd Street in Manhattan, watching the rain slide down the tall windows and thinking about the moment my life quietly split into two versions. The version where I believed my husband David loved me, and the version where I understood that love, for him, had always been a negotiation. My name is Claire Whitman. I was born in Connecticut, educated in Boston, and for most of my adult life I believed I had built a stable, respectable American life. I had a marketing degree from Northeastern, a calm personality, and a marriage that looked successful from the outside. David worked in finance, the kind of job that required long hours and expensive suits. I ran a small consulting practice from home while managing the quieter details of our life in Manhattan. If you had asked anyone who knew us, they would have said we were a power couple. What they didn't see was the slow silence that had crept into our home over the last 2 years. David had started staying late at work. At first it sounded normal. Wall Street thrives on exhaustion. But gradually the pattern changed. Late nights turned into weekend client dinners. His phone became something he kept face down on every table. Conversations between us shrank to logistics about groceries, bills, and the occasional polite smile over breakfast. I remember the first moment I felt something was wrong. Not because of a message or a phone call. Because of the bank statement. One quiet Saturday morning, I opened our joint account dashboard while drinking coffee at the kitchen island. I had always handled the household finances, so checking balances was routine. But that morning one number didn't make sense. $300,000 had been transferred out of our account, not gradually, not in small withdrawals. All at once. At first I assumed it was an error. Banks make mistakes sometimes. But when I clicked into the transaction history, my stomach tightened. The transfer had been authorized by David, and it had gone to something called Riverside Holdings LLC. I stared at the name for a long time. It meant nothing to me. No investment firm we used. No property company we owned. Just a quiet corporate entity sitting there like a locked door. When David came home that night, I didn't mention it. Not immediately. That might surprise some people. But I've always believed something important about human nature. When someone is lying to you, silence is more powerful than confrontation. So I waited. 3 days later, he mentioned it himself. We were sitting at dinner in a restaurant in Soho when he casually leaned back in his chair and said, "I'm thinking about helping someone launch a business." His tone was relaxed, almost rehearsed. "What kind of business?" I asked. "A boutique salon, high-end concept. Downtown location. It could be a really good investment." He said the word investment slowly, watching my reaction. And that was when I realized something else. He expected me to question him. He expected anger. Instead I smiled and said, "That sounds exciting." Something flickered across his face. Confusion maybe. But he quickly nodded and began describing marble floors, luxury styling chairs, and a brand concept he said was going to dominate the New York beauty market. He didn't mention the woman, but I already knew she existed, because 2 weeks earlier, I had seen her Instagram page open on his laptop. 20-4 years old. Perfect hair, perfect teeth, perfect confidence. Her name was Madison, and apparently she was about to become a salon owner. Funded by my husband. With money from our joint account. Most women in my position would have exploded right there in the restaurant. I didn't because, by the time I had finished explaining the boutique salon concept, I had already noticed something interesting about the bank transfer. The receiving company. Riverside Holdings LLC. The name sounded familiar. Not immediately. But somewhere in the back of my memory, it rang like a faint bell. So the next morning, while David left early for another client meeting, I opened my laptop and began researching. In New York, commercial property records are public. If you know where to look. It took about 20 minutes. When I finally found the listing, I leaned back in my chair and laughed quietly. Because the building David had leased for Madison's luxury salon sat on a corner of Tribeca, and the owner of the building was listed as Riverside Holdings, LLC. But that wasn't the important part. The important part was who owned Riverside Holdings. My family specifically. A real estate trust my grandfather had created decades earlier. And more specifically, The controlling manager of that trust. David didn't know it because the company structure was intentionally quiet. My grandfather believed privacy was the best form of asset protection. So every property in the trust operated through blind corporate layers. Even David had never asked about it. He always assumed my family's wealth was modest. But now my husband had unknowingly signed a commercial lease for his mistress's boutique. With my company for the first time since discovering the missing money, I felt something close to calm, because David thought he had created the perfect betrayal. But what he had actually done was something much more interesting. He had built his own trap. Over the next 4 months, I watched quietly as the salon construction began. David was suddenly very busy. Renovations were expensive, he said. Contractors, lighting, marble counters, imported mirrors from Italy. Every week another chunk of money disappeared from his personal accounts. I acted supportive. That part was important. Every time he mentioned the salon, I encouraged him. That sounds beautiful. I would say you should really invest in quality materials. If Madison wants it to succeed, the design has to be unforgettable. Each time I said those things, David looked more confident, more proud, more certain that I was the naive wife he believed me to be. Meanwhile, I received updates from the property management team that worked for the trust. Because technically I was now the landlord of Madison's boutique. And landlords. See everything. Construction permits, lease agreements, renovation budgets, insurance filings. I read every document. One clause in particular caught my attention. The lease agreement required tenant businesses to maintain strict financial disclosure standards and operating licenses before opening. Violating that clause allowed the landlord to terminate the lease immediately, legally. Without warning. For weeks, I said nothing. I simply waited, because revenge that happens too quickly feels emotional. Revenge that arrives at exactly the right moment feels inevitable. The grand opening of Madison's salon was scheduled for a Friday night in early September. Champagne.influencers. Luxury hair products. David talked about it constantly. He said it was going to be the biggest launch party Tribeca had seen in years. 3 days before the event, he handed me divorce papers. He did it calmly, almost gently. We were standing in the kitchen when he slid the envelope across the counter and said, "Claire, I think we both know this marriage isn't working anymore." I opened the envelope slowly. The papers were already signed. He had planned this carefully. "I hope we can keep things civil," he added. "I'll make sure you're financially comfortable." Financially comfortable. I almost smiled. Instead, I folded the papers and placed them back on the counter. Then I said something he didn't expect. "Of course." David looked relieved. He thought he had won. The next morning at 8 a.m. The property management team for Riverside Holdings sent an email to Madison's boutique. Attached to the email was a formal eviction notice. It cited violations of the lease agreement related to undisclosed financial restructuring and unauthorized corporate ownership transfers. The locks on the building were changed at 9:15 a.m. By noon, the salon that David had spent months building no longer legally belonged to its tenants. Every dollar he had invested in marble floors, luxury mirrors, and imported chairs remained inside the property, which meant it now belonged to the building owner. Me, David, called me 3 times that afternoon. I didn't answer the first 2. When I finally picked up the 3rd call, he sounded like a different person. "What did you do?" he demanded. "Nothing," I replied calmly. "That building, yes," I said softly. "That building." There was silence on the phone. Then I explained something David had never bothered to learn. "Riverside Holdings is my family's company." Another long pause. "You own the building?" "I manage the trust." David didn't speak for almost 10 seconds. Finally, he whispered something I will never forget. "Oh my God." Madison closed her Instagram account 2 days later. The salon never opened. And David moved into a small apartment in Queens, while his legal team tried to understand how $300,000 in renovations had disappeared overnight. Sometimes people ask me if I ever felt angry during all of this. The truth is something much simpler. Anger is loud, but quiet consequences are far more. Powerful. If you've ever experienced betrayal, humiliation, or someone who underestimated you, remember this. Silence is not weakness. Sometimes silence is strategy. And sometimes the people who believe they're building their future are actually building your victory. I remember the moment the silence finally broke. Not loudly. Not with shouting or courtroom drama the way television would portray it. Instead, it arrived in a quiet phone call at 7:18 on a gray Wednesday morning while I was standing in my kitchen, looking out over the Hudson River. The number on my phone belonged to David. By then, almost 3 weeks had passed since the salon doors were locked and the eviction notice had been delivered. 3 weeks since Madison's grand opening turned into a humiliating scene outside a building she could no longer enter. 3 weeks since the contractors realized the woman paying them had no legal right to the property anymore. 3 weeks since my husband discovered the building he had spent his money renovating belonged to me. The first week after the eviction had been chaos for him. I could see it through the messages he left and the legal emails that began arriving from his attorneys. They were aggressive at first. Threatening language. Accusations that the eviction had been retaliatory or malicious. But corporate law has a certain cold clarity to it. Paper trails. Don't care about emotion. And every document in that lease was airtight. By the second week, the tone of his legal team changed. The emails became cautious. They started asking questions instead of making accusations. They wanted clarification on the property ownership structure. They wanted to review the renovation clauses. That was when I knew the truth had finally landed. David had not only lost the salon investment, he had legally improved my property by nearly $300,000. Every marble counter, every imported chair, relighting fixture installed during those 4 months had increased the building's value, and under New York commercial property law, those improvements belonged to the landlord once the tenant defaulted, which meant they belonged to me. When I answered the phone that Wednesday morning, his voice sounded tired in a way I had never heard before. "Claire," he said quietly. I leaned against the kitchen counter and waited. "Did you plan this?" he asked. It was an interesting question, not because of the accusation inside it, but because of the assumption. David believed the eviction had been revenge, a calculated trap designed to destroy him. But the truth was much simpler. He had created the entire situation himself. "I read the lease," I said calmly. Another silence. "I didn't know you owned the building," he admitted. "I know." There was a long breath on the other end of the line. The sound of someone realizing that arrogance had consequences. "You could have told me," he said. I almost laughed at that. Told him, the man who secretly drained $300,000 from our joint account to build a luxury salon for his mistress, believed transparency should have come from me. Instead, I asked him something simple. "Why didn't you tell me about Madison?" The silence that followed was heavier, because some questions expose truth in a way lawyers never can. When David finally spoke, his voice was softer. "I didn't think you would understand." That sentence, more than anything else he had done, revealed the entire structure of our marriage. For years, he had assumed I was the quiet one, the supportive wife who stayed out of his financial decisions and career ambitions. He had mistaken calmness for ignorance. But calmness isn't ignorance. Sometimes calmness is observation. Over the next few days, something interesting began happening. Word started spreading. Not publicly, in newspapers or headlines, but in the quieter networks where reputations move quickly. David worked in finance, a world where trust and judgment determine whether someone is invited into deals or quietly excluded from them. And stories travel fast in those circles. The story that traveled wasn't flattering. A mid-level finance executive had secretly drained joint funds to build a business for his girlfriend. He signed a commercial lease without investigating ownership, invested hundreds of thousands of dollars into property improvements he didn't control. Then, he was evicted by the building owner, who turned out to be his wife. It sounded like a movie script when people repeated it. But reputation in finance is fragile. Investors and partners prefer people who demonstrate careful thinking. And David's actions had demonstrated the opposite. Within a month, I heard through a mutual acquaintance that his firm had quietly reassigned him away from client-facing roles. Not fired, but sidelined. That kind of shift often says more than termination. Meanwhile, the building in Tribeca had become something entirely different. Once the eviction process was complete, my property management team asked if I wanted to relist the space for lease. Instead, I visited the building myself. It was a warm afternoon in October when I walked through the glass doors and stepped inside the salon David had built. I had never actually seen the interior before. The marble floors were beautiful. White stone counters curved along the walls with precision. Elegant lighting fixtures reflected softly across the mirrors. Someone had spent months making the space feel luxurious. David had been right about one thing. The design was impressive, but the most interesting feeling wasn't anger. It was something quieter. Perspective. Because standing there in that perfectly renovated space, I realized something about the entire situation. David had tried to humiliate me instead. He had accidentally built something valuable. So I made a decision. Instead of leasing the property again, I opened my own business. Not a salon. Something much simpler. A consulting firm specializing in brand strategy for luxury startups. The kind of companies that need high-end creative positioning before they launch. The renovated interior already looked perfect for client meetings. Large mirrors became art pieces. The styling chairs were replaced with modern conference seating. The marble counters turned into collaborative workspace tables. Within 3 months, Whitman Advisory had its first clients. By spring, the firm had 5 employees and a waiting list of startups looking for guidance. One afternoon, nearly a year after the eviction, I was reviewing proposals with my team when the receptionist walked into my office. "There's someone here asking to speak with you," she said. "Who?" She hesitated. "David." For a moment the room felt very quiet. Then I stood up. When I walked into the lobby, he was sitting in one of the chairs near the window. He looked older than I remembered. Not dramatically older, but tired in a way that success usually hides. When he saw me, he stood slowly. "I didn't know this was your company," he said, glancing around the office. I smiled slightly. "It's the same building." He nodded for a few seconds. Neither of us spoke. Finally, he said something I never expected. "I underestimated you." It was an honest sentence. And honesty has a strange power when it arrives late. "What do you want, David?" I asked. He looked down at the floor for a moment. "Work," he said quietly. The irony of that moment was almost unbelievable. The man who had believed I was nothing without him was now standing in a building he helped renovate, asking for a job. But revenge wasn't the feeling I experienced. Instead, I felt something closer to clarity. Because the real lesson in everything that had happened wasn't about destroying someone. It was about understanding value. People who underestimate you reveal more about themselves than they realize. They show how limited their perspective is. David had believed power came from money, influence, and control. He had never considered another possibility. That quiet intelligence might be stronger than arrogance. I walked toward the glass doors and opened them. "David," I said gently, "this company isn't the right place for you." He nodded slowly. Then he stepped outside. And just like that, the story ended the way most real stories do. Not with shouting, not with dramatic victory. Speech is just a quiet moment where 2 people finally understood the truth. He had believed I was nothing, and I had simply allowed him to prove himself wrong. If there's one thing I want you to remember from my story, it's this. The people who doubt you are often building the very circumstances that will reveal your strength. Sometimes, the most powerful response to betrayal isn't anger. It's patience. Because, while others are busy underestimating you, you might be quietly building something far greater than they ever imagined. For a long time, after David walked out of the glass doors that afternoon, the office remained strangely quiet. My team returned to their work, laptops clicking softly, voices low in the meeting room down the hall. But I stayed by the window for a while, watching the movement of traffic along the Tribeca street below. New York has a way of making everything feel temporary. People rush past buildings without realizing how many stories those walls hold. Businesses open and close. relationships begin and end. But some moments remain etched into a place like fingerprints. That building had seen one of those moments. And somehow, without ever planning it, my life had been reshaped inside it. When I finally walked back into my office, the afternoon sun was starting to dip between the skyscrapers, casting long gold reflections across the marble floor David had once chosen so carefully. For a second, I remembered him standing inside the unfinished space, months earlier, describing how impressive the salon would look once the lights were installed and the mirrors were mounted. Back then, he had believed he was building a future. Just, not mine. I sat at my desk and opened the folder that contained the original lease documents from Riverside Holdings. Even now, the pages looked ordinary. Just contracts and clauses, legal language and signatures. Yet those pages had quietly redirected an entire life. Not only David's, mine, too. The truth people rarely talk about is that betrayal forces you to rebuild yourself in ways you never expected. When someone breaks the world you thought you understood, you're left standing in unfamiliar territory. Some people collapse in that moment. Others adapt. For the first few weeks, after the divorce papers had arrived, I had assumed my life was falling apart. The marriage I had spent nearly a decade building was ending. The man I had trusted had been living another story behind my back. But as the months passed, something surprising happened. The silence that once felt painful began to feel like space. To think space, to create space, to decide who I actually wanted to become. Whitman Advisory started small. Just 2 clients in the beginning, both early-stage luxury brands trying to find their voice in a crowded market. They had heard about my work through a mutual contact in Boston. I remember our first strategy session in the renovated conference room. Sunlight reflecting off the marble counters, the faint scent of fresh paint still lingering in the air. The founder of the first company looked around the space and said, "This office feels expensive." I smiled. "Good," I replied. Because the truth was, everything about that space carried a strange kind of symbolism. The chairs, the mirrors, the elegant lighting fixtures that David had once chosen for Madison's dream salon had become the foundation of a different kind of business. One built on strategy, rather than illusion. Within 6 months, the company grew faster than I had predicted. New York startups are always looking for guidance when they enter competitive markets, and word spreads quickly when someone consistently delivers results. Our client lists expanded, our team grew, and slowly the building itself began to change identity. The place that had once been intended as a monument to David's affair turned into something far more meaningful, a place where ideas turned into real companies. Sometimes life rewrites stories in ways you could never plan. One evening, about a year after everything happened, I stayed late at the office, finishing a proposal for a client, launching a luxury skincare line. The streets outside had grown quiet, and the office lights reflected softly in the tall windows. As I packed my laptop bag, I paused in the center of the room. There was a moment when the silence reminded me of the night David handed me those divorce papers in the kitchen. The memory was still clear, the envelope sliding across the counter, his voice explaining that the marriage wasn't working anymore at the time. It had felt like the ground disappearing beneath my feet. Now it felt like something else entirely. Perspective. I walked toward the window and looked out across the city lights. Somewhere in those thousands of buildings were millions of stories unfolding at the same time. People falling in love, starting businesses, ending relationships, chasing ambitions, and sometimes losing things they thought they needed. My phone buzzed softly on the desk behind me. When I checked the screen, it was a message from one of our newest clients, thanking us for helping secure a major investor earlier that day. The message ended with a simple line: "You've built something really impressive here." I looked around the office again. The marble floors, the tall mirrors, the warm glow of the lighting, fixtures, and I thought about how strange it was that the foundation of this company had begun with betrayal. But maybe that's the quiet lesson. Inside stories like this, people often believe revenge is about destroying someone, about anger, about dramatic victories, but real strength doesn't always look like that. Sometimes it looks like patience. Sometimes it looks like walking away from someone who underestimated you, And sometimes it looks like turning the consequences of someone else's arrogance into the beginning of your own future. David believed he was writing the final chapter of our story when he handed me those divorce papers. He believed he had already moved on to something better. But life has a way of revealing truth slowly, and the truth in our story wasn't about revenge. It was about understanding value, the value of quiet observation, the value of patience, and the value of never allowing someone else's betrayal to define the limits of your life. Because the people who underestimate you are often building the exact circumstances that will reveal your strength. They just don't realize it yet. And sometimes, the most powerful ending to a story isn't the moment someone loses. It's the moment you realize you've already won, simply by refusing to become the person they expected you to be. A few weeks after David walked out of the office that day, life continued in the quiet, steady rhythm that New York always imposes on people who decide to rebuild. Morning meetings, late-night proposals, clients flying in from California or Chicago, strategy sessions that stretched long past sunset. Whitman Advisory had grown faster than I ever imagined. And sometimes when I unlocked the glass doors in the morning, I still had to remind myself that this place was real. Not long ago, it had been nothing more than an unfinished dream David built for another woman. Now it was something entirely different. Winter arrived in Manhattan, the way it always does. Without asking permission, the sidewalks filled with people wrapped in long coats. Coffee shops smelled of roasted beans and cinnamon, and the early darkness made the city lights look brighter than usual. By December, our firm had signed its 10th client, and the office buzzed with the kind of quiet confidence that only comes when a team realizes they are building something that actually matters. One evening after a long strategy meeting, I stayed behind while the rest of the team left for the night. The office lights reflected across the marble floor, and outside the windows the city moved like a river of headlights. There are moments in life when everything becomes very clear. That night was one of them. For months, people had been asking me the same question in different ways. Friends from Boston, former colleagues, even a few journalists who heard whispers of the strange story behind the building. They all wanted to know how I felt about what happened. Did I hate David? Did I feel satisfied? Did revenge feel good? At first, I didn't know how to answer. But standing there alone in the quiet office, I finally understood the truth. What happened wasn't really about revenge, it was about transformation. David believed I was someone small, someone quiet, someone who depended on him to survive. He had built an entire narrative around that belief. The obedient wife, the predictable partner, the woman who would cry when he left and quietly accept whatever financial settlement he offered. And maybe that version of me had existed once. But betrayal has a strange power. It forces you to see yourself differently. In the months after everything collapsed, I realized something important about my own life. I had spent years supporting David's ambitions, helping him network, listening to his plans, celebrating his promotions. Yet I had never stopped to ask a simple question. What did I want? The answer arrived slowly, not in a dramatic flash of inspiration, but in small moments. During strategy calls with our first clients, during brainstorming sessions with my growing team, during quiet mornings when I realized I was excited to go to work again. Whitman Advisory was never supposed to exist. It was an accident created by arrogance. But sometimes accidents reveal the path you were always meant to take. The company grew steadily through the next year. Luxury brands, fashion startups, boutique hospitality groups. Each project brought new challenges and new opportunities to build something meaningful. And the building itself became a symbol. Clients loved the story behind it. Not the betrayal part that remained private, but the transformation. A space originally intended for one purpose that became something far more powerful. One afternoon in early spring, nearly 2 years after the eviction, I walked into the office lobby and saw a young woman sitting near the window, waiting for a meeting. She looked nervous, clutching a portfolio folder as she glanced around the room. When she saw me, she stood up quickly. "Are you Claire Whitman?" she asked. I nodded. I just wanted to say something before my meeting, she said softly. Your story is kind of famous in the startup world now. People talk about how you turned everything around. I smiled politely, a little surprised. What part of the story do they talk about? I asked. She hesitated. That you never yelled. You never fought publicly. You just let everything play out and built something better. Her words stayed with me long after she left that afternoon. Because that was the real lesson hidden inside everything that happened. Strength doesn't always look loud. Sometimes strength looks like patience. Sometimes it looks like silence, while someone else reveals exactly who they are. And sometimes it looks like walking forward with calm confidence, while the people who underestimated you struggle to understand. What went wrong? Late that evening, I stood once again by the same window, overlooking the Tribeca street below. The city lights flickered on one by one. As the sun disappeared behind the skyline, for a moment I thought about Kay with David, not with anger, not even with sadness, just with distance. Our lives had separated completely by then. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he eventually moved to another firm outside the city. Madison had disappeared from social media long ago, and the salon that never opened had become nothing more than an odd story people told at networking events. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest memories, but some truths remain. If there is one thing I learned from everything that happened, it's this. The most dangerous mistake someone can make is underestimating a quiet person. Because quiet people are usually observing. They notice details others ignore. They read the fine print. They understand patience. And while the loudest voices in the room are busy proving how powerful they are, the quiet ones are often building something far stronger. So if you ever find yourself in a moment where someone doubts your value, where someone believes they can replace you, betray you, or erase the life you built together, remember this. Your story doesn't end the moment someone walks away. Sometimes that moment is simply the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where you finally realize that the power you were searching for was never in someone else's approval. It was always in your own ability to rise quietly, rebuild patiently, and create a future no one else saw coming. And the most beautiful part of that future is this. The people who once underestimated you will eventually hear about what you became. Not through revenge, not through anger, but through the quiet success of a life they were never wise enough to appreciate. And by the time they understand what they lost, you will already be far beyond the place where their opinion matters. That is how the story truly ends. Not with someone losing, but with you finally discovering how strong you were all along.